Let's get this sports podcast party started, all right?
The J Reels Podcast.
What is happening, my good people? Greetings. How are you? How's it going? How's everybody doing out there? What is the latest and greatest? Hope everybody's doing well, feeling fantastic, in excellent spirits. After a super busy weekend in sports, I have my tail between my legs as I have plenty to be sorry for. Don't worry, I'll explain it all over the next hour plus, as this is the J Reels Podcast with your host, J Reels. For my first timers, welcome aboard. And for those who've been banging with me going back to the very beginning, somewhere in the middle, or even as early as this past Thursday, I welcome you guys and gals back. And if you follow my journey since day one, or if today's your first day, or anywhere in between that you've picked up the J Reels Podcast and have followed me throughout, as you know how much I love to babble about sports. But with that comes a great sense of responsibility as well as accountability and transparency. And I have to admit, this past Thursday's podcast wasn't one of my best, which therefore I have to roll out a big mea culpa and several apologies along the way in the process, because I feel like that after the fact, and especially with what had transpired over the weekend, there were things that popped up that said, I didn't mention that, or how come I didn't say this? And certainly I was not trying to breeze through a podcast, people, because as I mentioned, I take this seriously. Just to know that you carve out precious time out of your day to listen to what it is I have to say with all of the competition that's out there, whether it's people like myself that are trying to gain some traction in this podcast space, or those that have been doing it for quite some time that are big name personalities. So I do not take that for granted, and I certainly don't take it lightly. But with that being said, I do owe a bunch of apologies here along the way. And I'm going to start off with the NBA, because when I talked about the schedule there on Thursday, which I like to do just to kind of segue into what's going to take place over these next few days and highlight it and maybe even discuss it on the next podcast. And yesterday you had a matchup between the Nuggets and Thunder, two players that are 1 and 1A when it comes to the MVP race. And even though I did mention the game on Thursday's podcast, but ding, 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 why didn't the bells go off to think that Nikola Jokic, who's won 3 of the last 4 MVPs, and arguably last year, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, the Thunder, otherwise known as SGA, who could have been the MVP last year, right now is looking like the front runner. And that's not because of what took place there yesterday afternoon, as the Thunder did beat the Nuggets there convincingly behind 40 points, although 32 shots were taken by SGA. So you got to take that into consideration. But knowing on the heels of what happened Friday night, where the Nuggets beat the Phoenix Suns in overtime, where Nikola Jokic put up a historic triple-double, the first ever of its kind, 30 points, 22 assists, and 21 rebounds. You heard that correctly. Where a lot of the, I don't want to say momentum, but then, of course, the next day, including yours truly, thought that with Jokic's performance, and I understand the Suns, they've been flailing. They have been just trying to do whatever it takes to see if they could get into the NBA's 7 through 10 range in the play-in scenarios we talked about here over the last couple of weeks. But for Jokic to put up that type of game, and with him going into yesterday's matchup against the Thunder and SGA, and even though it's probably the furthest thing from his mind, because if you follow Jokic over the years, he's a guy that, yes, he plays basketball, but there's a lot more to life than just playing on the hardwood. And yesterday he had a pedestrian game for himself, 23 points. I believe he had double-digit rebounds and 9 assists, but certainly paled in comparison considering that they got blown out in the game and for what SGA put up as far as his numbers go. But not highlighting that game as a precursor to the two guys that are most likely going to be 1 and 2 in the MVP race, and I think it's going to be close. And I kind of liken this to a Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson MVP race, because all you got to do is look back at this past NFL season to where Lamar Jackson, who had already won multiple MVPs, including last year, similar to Nikola Jokic, winning last year and multiple MVPs. And then for Josh Allen, who had never won an MVP, and SGA, although arguably could have won last year, but now, as I mentioned, being the guy that is certainly the front runner to win it this year. and how I looked at Jokic coming off of that performance on Friday, and then with the game there yesterday, not to say that that was going to cement the MVP, not only with the victory by the Thunder, but the performance by SGA. And as the scheduling makers would have it, they're going to have a rematch tonight in OKC. So I don't know if that means that Jokic, if he has a big game and they win tonight, does that automatically mean that he's going to be the guy that may have the advantage when it comes to winning an MVP? Absolutely not. And even if he puts up a 50-point, 30-rebound, and 25-assist game, and a lot of people will probably look at that, although outrageous as it is, but they may say, well, look how important it is for Jokic on his team compared to SGA. And we could argue that, because similar to the Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson comparison, to where, to me, Josh Allen, if you take him away from Buffalo and you take away Lamar Jackson from the Ravens, at least with the Ravens, you still have Derrick Henry, you still have Mark Andrews, you still have Isaiah Likely, and we understand that the receiving core isn't great, although Zay Flowers is productive, and Rashad Bateman will give you flashes from here and there every now and again. But with Baltimore and having their multitude of weapons, to where the Bills only had, let's face it, James Cook, good running back, not Derrick Henry. They have two good tight ends in Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox, and their wide receivers, Amari Cooper, came in midseason, didn't really give you that much, although made a contribution there in the AFC Championship game. But with Keon Coleman, a rookie, and Khalil Shakur, who got a big payday here this offseason, good receivers, not great. So therefore, you take Allen off of the Bills, to me, he's more of an MVP there than Lamar Jackson was, at least this past season. And when you look at the Nuggets and Thunder, if you take away SGA this year only for the Thunder, what do you have left? And yes, they do have a very deep team. They have a very good defensive team, but they don't have that secondary guy. They don't have that go-to guy. They don't have a guy that in crunch time, besides SGA, that you could say, oh yeah, I could see him stepping up, making a big shot. Whereas with Jokic, and we understand that he's a unicorn. The guy is a center, and he plays like a point guard and shoots threes. I mean, the guy is just unbelievable. And maybe this is for another discussion down the road, but you could argue that Nikola Jokic could be, when it's all said and done, a top 15 player in the history of the sport. And that's not out of the realm of possibility. Now, where do you fit him in? That's another story. And maybe could even crack the top 10. I don't know. That's maybe a little bit premature, but I was thinking about it, how this guy could be a top 15 player all time. He's already won 3 MVPs. We haven't seen an offensive center to the likes of him in that degree, and that's including Kareem, that's including Shaq, that's including Moses Malone. You can go down through all the great centers in the history of the sport. This guy is arguably the best offensive center that the sport has ever seen. But that's another story for another day. But with Jokic, you still have Jamal Murray. You still have Michael Porter, who led his team in points yesterday with 24. You still have Aaron Gordon, who obviously can make a contribution. You have Russell Westbrook. I get it, late stages of his career, but he can make contributions here and there. So to me, that's why it's SGA's award to win this year, based on him leading his team, but not having that secondary player that if you would extract him, or let's say, God forbid, he gets hurt, how would they pick up the pieces in order for them to get the scoring that they're going to need? Where Jokic, although he scores, but he makes his teammates better. He distributes the ball in a way that we haven't seen the way the big man does. So when we talk about the MVP race, it is still SGA in my eyes, but Nikola Jokic is really this close. And they'll have a rematch there tonight, as I mentioned, so that's another game that we'll look out for, and we'll talk about the schedule a little bit later on. So that was my apology number one, not highlighting that game. Yes, I did say, oh, they're playing 1 o'clock ABC Sunday, but not from the standpoint of the matchup between the two and their MVP candidacy and how far they're going to go as far as which guy is going to make it when it's all said and done. Then you had Lakers Celtics on Saturday night. Tatum and Brown combined for 71 points, where Jason Tatum had 40. And then LeBron had to leave late with a groin issue, and that's going to be the next big thing here, because for LeBron, I don't think it's a similar issue than what he had there in his first year as a Laker, where on Christmas Day against the Warriors, he tore the groin and was out for about 17, 18 games. Maybe he didn't tear it, but it was bad enough that he missed a big chunk of time. And although in the post-game interview, he did say it wasn't anything close to that injury that he suffered about 5-6 years ago, but he is 40 years old. And granted that he is indestructible, and he's Superman and a T-1000 from another planet. But you have to at least raise an eyebrow to think whether or not this is going to be nagging. Can this heal in a week to two, considering that's the timetable for his return? And one more time, 40 years old, despite the fact that he's in impeccable shape and he takes great care of himself. But we understand that these type of injuries, it could just be one pull away or just one stretch where he could just be out for a considerable amount of time. And lucky for them, they do have Luka. But Luka's also nursing his own injuries, where you could tell late in the game there on Saturday night where he had that back issue. And although he did play well, scored 34 points, had that miraculous three that he banked off the glass, which was, come on, let's face it, that was luck. There's no way that you're going to bank a 32, 33-foot three-pointer and do that on purpose. But with that being said, Luka's certainly trying to pull his team back after they were down by 22 in the third quarter, and then they came all the way back to cut it to 4. But then the Celtics pulled away, and they were able to win the game there Saturday night without LeBron during the final stretch of that fourth quarter. And again, LeBron's absence here over the course of the next couple of weeks, I'm sure they're going to proceed with caution, knowing that obviously they're going to need him in the big picture when you get to April, May, and possibly June. But this is one thing that we will all monitor from afar to wonder whether or not, once he's back on the court, healthy, ready to go, is this going to be a thing where in the back of our minds, we have to think that, hey, he is just one step, one just tweak away from maybe hurting this thing to where he's going to be back on the shelf and maybe during a time frame where the Lakers are going to need him the most, and that would be, in particular, the playoffs. And in the process with the Celtics beating the Lakers, they snapped their 8-game winning streak. Tonight they're in Brooklyn to play the Nets, so unfortunately for those who are going to head out to the Barclays Center, no LeBron, but at least you'll get to see Luka tonight as the Lakers continue their trip where they go to Milwaukee on Thursday. So that's going to be an interesting matchup between those two teams. But that, of course, is for down the road. And then if you rewind to the game there on Thursday night, a very competitive game between the Knicks and Lakers out in the Staples Crypto.com arena. And for that to go into overtime, and that was tooth and nail down the stretch to where Jalen Brunson, who put up 39 and 10, but also suffered a big injury, turning his ankle to where he's going to be out for 2 weeks. And the Knicks, who are on a West Coast trip as it is, they lost the first 2 games of that trip in LA between the Lakers Thursday and the Clippers Friday. Tonight they're in Sacramento, then they go to Portland. So for Brunson, who will be on the shelf 2 weeks with an ankle, we understand those suckers don't heal rather quickly, but you would think with rehab, and I'm sure with a lot of the science and technology, you would think maybe 2 weeks' time he'll be back. Will he be the same type of player? You would think. But at the same time, if it's anything of the variety of a high ankle sprain, which I don't believe that's the case, but we all know high ankle sprains never heal during a regular season or a postseason. So something to keep in mind there. And that was a game that was hotly contested where the Knicks had a big lead there, especially in the fourth quarter. The Lakers came all the way back, then went into overtime, and then sure enough, the Lakers were able to pull away. And I know the big story coming out of that, which I'll get to a little bit later on with Stephen A. and LeBron. At first, I wasn't going to talk about it. I didn't even mention it on my YouTube channel at JReels, which is, I do my 1-minute shorts, and you figured I would have spent some time on that, but I did not. But I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it was interesting to know that with that conversation during that game, and I don't recall if that was prior to the game or during a timeout or what have you, but it was certainly bizarre to watch that unfold. And again, I'll share my 2 cents on that. And what was also important and a kind of an under-the-radar move by the Knicks, and interestingly enough, check those receipts. I talked about this about 2-3 weeks ago. I believe this was after the game that the Celtics beat the Knicks on Saturday night. That was the night before the Super Bowl, a little over a month ago. And how the Knicks, I felt that they needed a guy that not only had experience in the postseason, and also a guy that's going to provide toughness and even attitude. And I mentioned the name PJ Tucker, considering that he was a guy that had sat out due to contract negotiations that went awry in LA with the Clippers. And then they traded him to the Jazz, and then the Jazz released him, considering he was going to be a buyout guy, and then was now a free agent. But the Knicks just recently picked him up for a 10-day contract. So let's see how that goes. They do have Mitchell Robinson back in the fold, which was big, and the Knicks are going to need him. Hopefully he can stay on the court because the guy's always hurt and is always in foul trouble in the process. But PJ Tucker, I believe, would be a perfect Knick. He's a guy that will harken back to those days of Charles Oakley and Anthony Mason. Again, brings that grit, that toughness that you need, and even that championship experience, considering he did win a title with the Bucks in 2021. So, listen, he's a complimentary guy. He's not going to be a guy that's going to play a ton of minutes and a guy that's going to get a bunch of points. He's going to do all the dirty work. He's also going to get in opponents' faces if he has to, and that's what's going to provide a lot of that leadership that I think the Knicks need, because guys like Jalen Brunson, who we all know, that is the quote-unquote captain of the team, but Mikal Bridges, not really proven, especially once you get into the postseason, and even for Karl-Anthony Towns, for all of his talent, he's going to be under a microscope during the playoffs as far as the Knicks will go. So to have a guy like Tucker in the mix certainly is going to, I would believe, provide big-time dividends for a Knicks team. And again, not that he's going to get a ton of time, and not to say that he's going to be the final piece of the puzzle, but he's going to be a piece that the Knicks desperately need. And how far that could take him once you get into April and May is going to be huge. And of course, his playing time and what type of shape he's going to be, that's another thing. But I thought that was a good signing, a little under the radar. 10 days, so let's see if he plays well enough to warrant another 10-day contract. And if that's the case, if he's able to play out those two 10-day contracts, then he'll latch onto the team for the rest of the year, and away we go. But other than that, with the NBA, should I even bring up Mark Cuban in his comments about the Luka Doncic deal? What the hell, because I did mention that on Thursday's podcast, talking about the last 5 weeks of the Maverick organization, how it's just been in a complete free fall. And then Cuban, I even mentioned him from this regard, how the press has not gone to him to get a quote or two just to find out his thoughts about the deal. And even more so, if he was the owner, would he have made that deal? And of course, he didn't go there. He didn't even touch it. He says, I'm not going to make a comment on that. And of course, he's going to do that as much as we would want to hear what he has to say. But I'm sure if he was the majority owner, which obviously he's not, that goes to the distinction of Patrick Dumont. Now, he still does have stake in the team as a minority owner, but obviously he's not the guy that's going to sign the checks and make any big-time decisions when it comes to personnel and the team overall. But for him to admit that they should have gotten more for Luka, and again, this is old news. We've talked about this last month, but just to get it from the horse's mouth, and in this case, Mark Cuban, just to hear him say that, considering when you look at what the Knicks got for Mikal Bridges, and we all know Mikal Bridges isn't even anything close to what Luka Doncic is as far as the talent and what he's done here throughout the course of his first 5-6 years in the league. But it's not a secret. It is not a situation where we knew the Mavericks should have gotten a hell of a lot more from the Lakers, considering how young he is, still has at least a decade left in his body, you would think, despite the fact that his body seems to be breaking down in front of our eyes, even at the tender age of 25, or now 26, I believe. But still, we could rehash that deal until we're blue in the face, but we won't. But it was just interesting to hear Cuban come out to talk about how they should have gotten more, considering what other teams had gotten for other players, and certainly did not touch the fact that if he was the owner, what he would have done as far as trading Luka is concerned. And then let me throw this out here, which I thought was very good. The first of 9 episodes for Celtic City, that's on Max, which was produced by Bill Simmons, the Celtic fan extraordinaire. He talked about in this first episode the early part of the Celtics from 1950 really to 63, when Walter Brown owned the team, when they first got it in 1946, when the NBA first came into existence, and then for Walter Brown to tab Red Auerbach, even back then, think about this, as the guy who was not only the coach, but the GM, the janitor, the payroll guy, he was everything. And for Red Auerbach, we know about his greatness, and not to rehash what he's done throughout his career, but him not even thinking about drafting Bob Cousy, considering went to Holy Cross, which is pretty much right down the street from where the Celtics played at the old Boston Garden, which is now the TD Garden, although different building, but still in that same real estate. And talking about Bob Cousy, how he was the guy leading into Russell. And once he retired in 63, which I thought was fascinating because that first episode was pretty much the origin, the beginning of the Celtics, 263, and for Russell to win those titles with Cousy early on, and then for Russell to talk about how it was an honor to play with Cousy, but then the media starting to twist that, saying that, hey, we know this is Cousy's team. How do you feel? And it's like, wait a minute. I feel like this is just my team as much as Cousy's team, because if it wasn't for me, we wouldn't be winning these championships. And you know what? God rest his soul, he is right. So with that, and of course, a lot of the racism stuff that went on during that time, a preseason game in Lexington, Kentucky for Frank Ramsey, who was from Kentucky and went to the University of Kentucky, how Sam Jones and Satch Sanders went to a restaurant, and although they were players on the team, but when asked, oh, are you guys players? And just for grins and giggles, they said, no, we're not. And they had their menus taken away, and then they walked out. Obviously, just harrowing stories from a time. Think about this. This was prior to the civil rights movement there in the mid to late 60s. So this is a time where the players walked out. And, of course, a lot of the white players that the Celtics had, Tommy Heinsohn, Frank Ramsey, Bill Sharman, of course, Cousy, where they were, obviously, they went to play in this game, and without getting into it any further, because I got a lot to discuss, but it was very fascinating, very compelling, and part 2 is tonight of 9 episodes, and I'm sure it's going to talk about from that time, from 63 to the end of the decade, where Russell was the player coach, winning that crazy game 7 in LA, the Don Nelson shot that bounced up the rim high in the air and then through the hoop. A series that Jerry West, prior to his passing, said that was one of the worst losses he's ever endured as a player. So I'm sure it's going to cover that time frame from mid-60s. And, of course, Russell with the civil rights movement. And I'm sure that meeting that he had with Jim Brown and Muhammad Ali and a young Lou Alcindor, I'm sure that's going to be prevalent in this episode. So very good stuff if you want to go back in the archives. And, of course, I'm a Celtic fan, so you know I gobbled that up. So definitely check that out. And then I guess lastly here, let me talk about it real quick before I move on to other things with Stephen A. and LeBron. And I know he addressed this on Friday. And not knowing the full details, of course, we could pretty much come up with him, Stephen A., talking about LeBron and how the influence that he had to the Laker organization, not only drafting Bronny, but also bringing him on the team and him being a part of the team and the nepotism that goes on there. And I don't know the exact comments, etc., but here's what I will say as far as a guy like Stephen A. and even a guy like myself who is trying to blaze a trail in this industry, and one who not only wants to be entertaining but also credible, etc. Now, what was said by Stephen A. and LeBron confronted him there, and he says, yeah, don't talk about that smack, bro, and gave that mean stare and walked off, and Stephen A. just kind of shrugged and sat down and addressed it there. And of course, you can go back on YouTube and you'll see it there, I guess on one of the ESPN YouTube channels. But the one thing that I'll say, and I've been on Stephen A's case over the years, I've clapped back at him, not necessarily clapped back, I've clapped at him, he hasn't clapped back at me. But as much as I've watched Stephen A. from afar and he says some outlandish things, I understand a lot of it's for TV and whatever, and who knows if he means half the stuff, that's a whole other thing. And I'm sure he does mean it, but whatever. But the one thing is that he's right. And I understand he's a mouthpiece for a lot of guys that are out there that maybe won't say certain things. And maybe to a certain extent I've said in reference to the Bronny issue with the Lakers and how much of the influence his father has, etc. Now, of course, it's not a knock on him being a parent. And that I've never even addressed. To me, it was like, of course, the reason why he's on the team and all those things. But I will say this. Stephen A. is not off base with what he said. Now, he shouldn't go ahead and not necessarily attack, but he shouldn't critique LeBron as a dad where he's trying to look out for the best interests of his son. And I believe that's what the conversation was had between Stephen A. and LeBron, or LeBron to Stephen A., I should say. But in closing, although he's accurate with some of the things he says, but that's the thing about Stephen A. He should have just kept it to, well, the only reason why Bronny is in the league is because of his dad. Not necessarily, oh, LeBron, I wouldn't do this, this, and this because Bronny's in the league, or whatever it is that he said. Because that's where you're going to cross the line there. And we all know that if you're going to critique a player or if you're going to even critique the situation, you have every right to do, because it's public knowledge, it's out there, and this is what we do as talking heads. But to say that, oh, well, he's doing too much for his son, or, oh, he's saying this, whatever what was said, that's where he has to draw the line and not go overboard. And I believe he's apologized and all that. So I'm not trying to be an apologist for Stephen A. or break out the pom-poms for him. He's a grown man. He's got to handle that, and he has handled that. But for me and what I do, because I call it like I see it as well, I'm not going to poo-poo, or not going to lay low, or not going to take the high road. If I feel like something I see that needs to be critiqued and is going to be fair in that criticism, I'm going to do it. And that goes back to what I've talked about from the very beginning, having that integrity, having the wherewithal to know when I'm wrong, to have that accountability, to be able to apologize to you guys and gals when I know I didn't give you a full, complete podcast, or I missed out on a topic, or I didn't follow through on a particular subject. All that. That's what ties into that. And I understand he did that. And again, I'm not a huge Stephen A. fan. I followed him. And again, I look at him as a guy that, hey, he's the mouthpiece for all sports fans for the most part. But with that being said, I know that things have to be separated when it comes to what's going to be said about family members, and especially in this case between father and son on the same team, etc. So I just thought to throw my 2 cents on that. And even though with other players getting at him, whether it was KD early on, calling him a clown, that he's never been to a shoot around or a locker room, whatever, and we get that. We understand that. But guess what? We're fans of the game. We watch the game. We follow the game. So even though we may not have graced the court, or have been part of a layup line, or have been part of a road trip, understood. Only a select, seldom few, or very rare few get to have that privilege. But that doesn't mean that as fans, from watching, eating, breathing, drinking, sleeping, sports all the time, that we can't critique it. And that's the thing, and that's the problem that I have with some of these athletes that come out and try to get at people like myself. Not that they've gotten at me, but my point is that we have every right to critique it. Just like if they're fans of movies, or fans of music, or fans of any entertainment or whatever, and if they feel like, oh, I didn't like that, or oh, that was a bad performance, or oh, that I didn't like that painting, they have every right to do so. Especially if that's what they're passionate about and that's what they follow. And that's why, when it comes back to yours truly, that's why I have my platform to do that. It's going to be fair. No clickbait, no outrageous comments or whatever, but it's going to be fair across the board, and that's all you're going to get when it comes from my mouth to your ears. All right, so now NBA, let's see what we got here. As far as the latest with the standings and things of that nature, we know about Cleveland and OKC. They're well ahead in their respective conferences. Celtics have some separation over the Knicks, so they look like they're going to be the 2 seed. And they have 4 games over the Bucks. We've talked about Bucks, Pacers, Pistons, how they're all jumbled up separated by a game. Then you have Hawks, Magic, Heat, and Bulls. And the 4 that are going to comprise of the play-in scenario in the East. And even though the Sixers seem to be hanging on there, 3 back, but we would think the Bulls will be all right when we get to the middle of April. And then out west, even though the Lakers have a game in hand with the Nuggets, but they're tied as far as the standings go, but percentage points to the Lakers because of that game advantage. Memphis and Houston, that'll be an interesting first round if that would be the case, considering that they're right in the middle, although only separated by 2 games between the Lakers and the Nuggets. And then you have the Warriors, who are now in the 6th seed, and they played well here recently. So they've gotten out of that 7-10 range where it's T-Wolves, Clippers, Kings, and Mavericks. Mavericks hanging on for dear life, literally, because they only had 7 players dressed in the game yesterday, which is just outrageous. I mean, they've been decimated by injuries, as we know, and talked about there on Thursday. And now they're literally piecing it together with Scotch tape, bubblegum, and some sort of adhesive just to even have a bench to have players come in and out. And then with the Suns, they did win yesterday, beating the Mavericks, and that was a big game. And I didn't talk about that, at least on Thursday's podcast. But for the Suns, who are a game back, game and a half behind the Mavericks, and because of all their injuries, and who knows if Anthony Davis could even return to play, I would think when it's all said and done, the Suns may sneak in there and get that 10 seed, or at least be part of the play-in scenario. So that's what you have there in the NBA. And as far as the schedule, like I mentioned, Denver, OKC, a rematch there tonight. which is going to be on NBA TV. So you have a doubleheader there on that network with that, and then the Knicks in Sacramento. Besides that, I mentioned Lakers and Nets. For those in the tri-state area, if you could get a ticket to go out there, go do so. No LeBron, of course. Orlando at Houston, Phoenix at Memphis. Those are your big games of note. I'm not going to talk about the lesser games that are on the schedule. Then tomorrow's slight schedule where you have Milwaukee, Indiana. That's a big game there. Excuse me, two teams that are battling it out there as far as the middle part of the Eastern Conference. Nothing else there. And then Wednesday, OKC at Boston. That is an NBA preview, I might add. I actually picked those two teams to go to a final, I might add. ESPN Double Dip, that's your 7:30 game, followed by Minnesota and Denver is your 10 o'clock on ESPN. And then in between, Clippers at Miami, Phoenix at Houston. Other than that, that's all you have there with the NBA for the start of the week. All right, now as far as the college, let me get to my apology number 2. And that being the Auburn Tigers, who did lose to Texas A&M, as I talked about. And yes, I knew that they had a game against Alabama here on Saturday. And yes, that was going to be their game to close out the season. And even though they beat them in Alabama earlier this year, but I should have highlighted and noted that even with Auburn losing that game and possibly losing their 1 seed going into this week, and of course the recent rankings haven't been released as of this moment, but knowing that they had to play against Alabama, and Alabama winning in a last-second shot there by Mark Sears, who did not have a good game, only scored 9 points, but had the game winner at the buzzer, I should have put a lot more attention to detail to that game, knowing that they have now lost a couple of games heading into conference tournament week, and whether or not Auburn, who we would think there's going to be, they'll have a 1 seed when it's all said and done. Now, barring them losing in the first round here, maybe not. Maybe they'll still end up being a 1. Now, they won't be 1 overall if that's going to be the case. And right now, you could argue whether or not they are going to be number 1 overall. It's quite possible that Duke, I would think, as of this afternoon, they may be the number 1 team in the nation. Now, they beat North Carolina, although they had to struggle a little bit there in the first half. But for Auburn, and just them specifically here, you have to wonder whether or not they're running out of gas. Now, obviously, they're going to make it to the tournament. And, of course, once they're in, anything could happen. But knowing that they were a bona fide 1 seed overall and still be a number 1 depending on what region, but they may not be that team that has been hot and has been just steady throughout the course of the year. And now that they've not only hit a speed bump, but they've certainly hit an abutment here to the point where, all right, the car isn't totaled, but now it's a little bit bent out of shape. So let's see if Auburn can get back to business here this week, maybe go on a run to at least a conference final. And if they do so, they could end up being number 1 overall, unless Duke happens to slip up here in the ACC tournament. But I would think Auburn, as of right this very moment, I'm sure this is their time to recalibrate and get themselves back on the beam, because they do not want to go into this tournament. Let's say even if they get to a semifinal and lose, I'm sure they want to get to a final. If they lose in a final to whomever, all right, I'm sure they would settle for that. Not that they want to lose, but at least get to a final. Anything short of that would certainly be alarming at this point, because you do not want to go into this tournament on the heels of, let's say, 3 losses over the course of the last 10 days, and then kind of shoot your shot to see where you're going to end up in what region. Yes, you're going to end up being a number 1, but you won't be number 1 overall, and then you're going to have to deal with that once you get into the bulk of the tournament, which will begin a week from this coming Thursday. So if you're Auburn right now, all right, things are a little shaky. You can right the ship here over the course of these next 4 or 5 days. So, we will uncover all of it as it unfolds here throughout the course of the week. And then obviously you have Selection Sunday, and a week from today, we'll go through the brackets and see where the where the committee has selected these teams as we get set for the madness in March as we approach the Ides of March, the middle of the month. So that's what you have there with the college. So that's apology number 2, not unpacking the scenario with the Tigers and what that would mean for them heading into this week. And as it was with that loss in their building, if they would have won the game, and if obviously it was a close game as you saw, but because they lost and I did not highlight that matchup there on Saturday, that is my bad, apology number 2. So we will see what's going to happen here with a lot of the college tournaments and a lot of the at-large teams and a lot of the independents that are just the one-team bids coming out of those particular tournaments and those conferences. We'll be all over that here from now until Sunday. Check the YouTube channel at JReels for anything that's earth-shattering or anything that's going to happen here throughout the course of this week as we get set for the madness, which I get it begins, in essence, a week from tomorrow with the first four. But as you all know, the tournament doesn't really begin until the 20th, again, 10 days from today. So that's what I got to college. And if I missed out on anything else with the college, I'll pick up from where that left off on Thursday because I still got a lot of other things to discuss here. And you know what? I won't go to the NHL just yet because, no, you know what? I actually have to go to the NHL. I understand the NFL is on and popping at this moment. And you know what? After the NHL, I'll get to the likes of the gridiron because my apology number 3 has to come from the NHL. And you had a trade deadline on Friday, which you did have a smattering of trades, more so a couple weeks back, and even a couple last week where the Bruins had pretty much put up a fire sale, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the apology number 3 comes as a surprise, compounded with a shocker at the deadline, and the two big deals of note. The shocker was Brad Marchand, who currently is nursing an upper body injury as I lace up my skates to take my trip around the ice. For Marchand, out with an upper body injury. He should return before the end of the year, but he got traded to the Panthers in a big deal there, and there's conditional picks that's going to take place here. So if Marchand does play half the playoff games, that pick, which I believe right now is a second-round pick, could be a first-round pick, I believe, in this upcoming draft. If not this one, then next year for sure. But for Marchand, we all know that guy is a water bug. He's a pesky son of a gun. Blood and guts type of guy. Also heart and soul of that Bruin team. The last remaining member of the 2011 Stanley Cup team. Winning team, I might add. They did go to a cup in 13 and 19. Lost both of those instances to Chicago and St. Louis. But for Marchand, that was a shrewd pickup by the Panthers. Unrestricted free agent at the end of the year. So to think they went all in on Marchand, knowing his experience, knowing that he's won a cup. Not that the team needs that type of player, considering they won a cup last year. But he's a guy that you all know. Hard-nosed player. He's a lunch pail player, but also has a penchant for scoring big goals. And that is a significant upgrade to bring to that room with Matt Tkachuk, who has been ailing here, as you know. So for the Panthers to bring in that type of reinforcement, I will even go as far as saying a better version of Tkachuk in this regard. He is a guy that, I get it, Tkachuk will get his nose dirty, but he has that much more years under his belt than Tkachuk. Tkachuk is what, 10 years as junior? I think he's what, 37? Marchand to Tkachuk being 27 or 28. Ages aside, you're bringing in a guy who has just a ton of experience, a guy that pretty much will just be a smooth transition, whether or not Tkachuk does come back, and we would think he will, to go along with Marchand. So I think he fits like a glove to that team and will certainly be a tough out, as you know, being a defending Stanley Cup champ and to bring in a guy like him. Now, the surprise, and this is where my apology number 3 comes in, is Mikko Rantanen. Now, remember, he got traded from Colorado to Carolina early this year, and Rantanen, who is an unrestricted free agent, another guy who the Hurricanes were banking on to provide some offensive scoring power, etc. And there were rumors about Rantanen being dealt by the trade deadline, even though he just got to Carolina 5 minutes ago. So I didn't bring that up as a guy that could have been on the block. And even though there were a couple other names that were out there, and I'll get to a one Brock Nelson in a minute, but for Rantanen to then be shipped to Dallas, and Dallas is a team that I actually picked to go to a final this year, not that that matters for those out there that are listening, but I did think that the Stars are going to have a big year considering that they've gone to back-to-back Western Conference Finals, and now they bring in Rantanen and also sign him on the dotted line, 8 years, $96 million deal, and in return, they sent back a ton, considering they sent back 2 first and third round picks for this year and next year. And Rantanen, let's face it, I get it that maybe it was contingent on them signing Rantanen, the Stars, in order for them to get that type of stock back where they're going to get 4 draft picks in the process. And I don't know if any of those are conditional. No, I believe over the course of these next 2 years. And Rantanen, listen, he's a big-time scorer. Now, did they give up too much? I think they did. But if they felt the Stars that this was a guy that was the final piece of their puzzle to get them to a final and win it, then you know what? I guess they had to do this deal. I thought it was a little bit too rich for my blood if I'm the Stars, but they were desperate. They needed to get a guy to go along with the Jamie Benns and the Jason Robertsons of the world. And not that I follow the Stars here closely. Now, I followed them from afar in reference to their race in the Central between Winnipeg and now Colorado, who's been playing well and sneaking up on the Stars. But how I look at it is that I did not mention Rantanen and how he could be a piece that was moved by the deadline. So, again, my apologies for that. But you had a ton of other trades here. As you know, the Islanders traded away Brock Nelson, their longest tenured Islander player, to Colorado, where they get the young player and a one. Well, that's Casey Middleton. I'm going to get to him with Boston in a second. I just wanted to talk from an Islander standpoint. They traded for a defenseman, Oliver Killington, who they traded. Pretty much they flipped him in the process, and I'll talk about that later, but they also got a first rounder back this year, or next year's conditional, and also a prospect, Colin Ritchie. So for the Islanders with Nelson, a guy that has scored 30 goals in the past over the course of the last 3 seasons, this year, another unrestricted free agent, so the Islanders got something back, although they traded Collington to the Anaheim Mighty Ducks for future considerations. But the Islanders knew that even though they're inching close to the final 2 wildcard spots, but they may fall short, and they felt because they weren't going to get anything back for Nelson, which could be a sign that they maybe think they couldn't re-sign him. So you got to keep that in mind, unless he's going to come back at a hometown discount. Who knows? Maybe Nelson's looking for his last big payday, considering he's been with the team for 12 years. But for the Islanders, I guess that was a move they had to do, even though they shipped one of the guys back in the trade for future consideration to Anaheim. So who knows? And the first rounder is in 26 or 27. Let me slow it up a little bit. And they also got a conditional third rounder in 28. So they did get something back for Nelson, despite the fact that he's a rental. And then you had the Bruins. Let's talk about them. They had done so much to their team that even David Pastrnak, their top goal scorer, said, this is a whole different team. Considering Trent Frederick, Max Jones out. Considering Brad Marchand gone. Charlie Coyle, who they sent to Colorado for Casey Middlestead, 18-year-old. He's also out. Brandon Carlo shipped to Toronto, where the Maple Leafs made a couple of deals. And also bringing in the center from Philadelphia in a one, Scott Lawton. So the Maple Leafs looking to try to get themselves in position to get past the first round, to go deep into the postseason, to finally win a Stanley Cup for the first time in, count them, 58 years since 1967. So give it up for what the Maple Leafs have done here at this deadline. But the Bruins, they figured the hell with it. We might as well just ship everybody out. Let's just start over. Let's not even worry about trying to piecemeal it here and there. They certainly had a fire sale there in Beantown. And you know what? Let's see whether or not these young players or draft picks or the guys that they got back are going to pan out. But this is a team that 2 years ago had the most points and most wins in regular season NHL history. And now here they are. Look like they may be on the outside looking in, as they currently are constituted in the Eastern Conference. But they made a ton of moves here. And you have to wonder whether or not that the Bruins, moving forward, are going to be a team that is going to be in transition, meaning that they're going to blow it up and start over, even though they still have Charlie McAvoy and the aforementioned David Pastrnak and a couple other pieces that they have on the team. But yes, the Bruins certainly did a lot here over the course of this last couple of week stretch. And then also the Vegas Golden Knights bring back Riley Smith. He was on that Stanley Cup winning team a couple of years ago by way of the Rangers, who the Rangers traded him, and another guy that's going to be a free agent after this year. And they got back a prospect and a third-round pick in the process. So, yes, it was a frenetic, a frenzy trade deadline there on Friday where the waters were actually quiet. I called it a quote-unquote dead line as early as Thursday, but a lot of transactions took place, and hopefully I kept you up to date with what was happening there. And also on top of that, the Panthers picked up Vitek Vanacek, the backup goalie who actually won there in his first start there yesterday, because they traded for Spencer Knight, if you know, for Seth Jones as we talked about there last week, and also Nico Sturm, who they also picked up for depth there at the forward position. And then you have Alex Ovechkin, another goal, an empty netter there yesterday against the Seattle Kraken. He is single digits away at 886, 9 away from breaking Wayne Gretzky. And the one thing I will say that I haven't talked about and I haven't heard anybody else talk about, now that he's in single digits and with 18 games left, he could just score a goal every other game in order for him to break Wayne Gretzky. But will the pressure start to mount? Are teammates going to pass him the puck a little bit extra, especially once we get deeper toward this final stretch of games to where, let's say, he hasn't scored a goal in the last 6 games, or I should say in the next 6 games. And now he's going to be pressing to try to break this record this year. And he may not have that comfort of scoring a goal or having a 2-goal game or even, let's say, a hat trick along the way, where he could ease some of that pressure off if he has a multiple goal scoring game. So let's see. He got an empty netter. He's got a lot of empty netters, as you know, and I'm sure he is going to be prominent on that ice late in games when the Capitals have a lead, whether it's a goal or 2-goal lead there late. You know he's going to be out there to try to get that goal and get even that much more closer to climbing Mount Gretzky. So it's going to be interesting to see. Let's see how these next few days and next week unfolds. We'll take a look at the schedule. And again, will the pressure start to mount knowing that he's in single digits here and he can almost taste having that record in his hands before game 82 and when it's all said and done? Now, as far as the standings here, I know that the Panthers have played well. They have now have a 4-point lead over the Maple Leafs. And think about it, the Panthers, now with these trades, although you're not going to see them anytime soon, but they had a very big weekend. They beat the Lightning, as we talked about there, and the Lightning have hit a little bit of an abutment as well, but they beat the Blue Jackets, they beat the Sabres 5 in a row, 4-point lead over the Maple Leafs right now, and the Lightning are 1 point behind Toronto for second place there in the division, which is big because they meet up again in the first round, which we've seen them do over the last few years. You want to have the home ice. So if Tampa does happen to get the second place nod, they will have the home ice in that first round over Toronto. Just something to keep in mind as we move it along. We know what the Capitals have done. Carolina has a 6-point lead over the Devils, so they look like they'll be fine, and they played well here over the course of this stretch. Now, as far as the wild card is concerned, you have the Rangers, who have not played well here. They lost in overtime to Ottawa on Saturday, and then they got blown out by Columbus there yesterday. And Columbus obviously ahead of them in the standings, as well as Ottawa, as you know. So for the Rangers, who are just 1 point behind the Senators and 2 points behind the Blue Jackets, so that was a big loss for them yesterday, because if they would have won, they would have had that spot, the number 1 wild card seed in the Eastern Conference. And then the Red Wings have certainly hit the skids here, loses the 5 in a row, and that dates back to that home and home when they got swept by the Blue Jackets, and they haven't won since then. So they haven't won in almost 2 weeks. So the Red Wings have certainly been sputtering here. But with the wild card scenario, we know that with Ottawa just a point ahead of the Rangers, and with the Red Wings, Canadians, Bruins 3 points behind Ottawa, and the Islanders 4 points behind them, it is certainly a cluster of teams trying to see whether or not that they could maybe get on a roll, get on a streak, and see if they could get through and break through to get into the Eastern Conference playoff mix. And then out west, we know about the Jets and how well they played. Now, they do have a 6-point lead over the Dallas Stars. And Dallas, like I mentioned, they played well. And Colorado, although they're 8 points behind the Stars, but they've won 5 in a row, and they've actually overtaken the Minnesota Wild in the division, to where the Wild have now fallen back to the top seed in the Western Conference as far as the wild card goes. Calgary is 6 points behind them, so that's what separates those two teams. And then you have Calgary with Vancouver, and St. Louis is 1 point behind the Flames, and then you have Utah 4 points behind, and then Anaheim 7 points behind. I'll just cut it off there. But now with Vancouver and St. Louis playing well, trying to eke a little closer to the Flames, it looks like it's going to be a 3 or 4 team race just for the 1 playoff spot. So, we'll keep that in mind. And then Vegas with a 4-point lead over Edmonton and a 3-point lead over the Kings that the Oilers have. So it is certainly highly contested. Stretch here where you got about anywhere between 17, 18 games to go in the National Hockey League. And as far as the schedule this week, let's take a look. Tonight, Detroit at Ottawa. That's a huge game there for wildcard seeding, or wildcard positioning, I should say. Toronto at Utah, only because Utah's in the mix. Florida at Boston, but then again, Boston, I know, they're in the mix there, as we know. Columbus at New Jersey. Ottawa at Philly. Vegas and Pittsburgh. Tampa at Carolina. Colorado at Minnesota, so that's a big game there because Minnesota's how many points behind? I think they're 2 points behind, if I'm not mistaken. The Wild are 2 points behind. They have 76 points to Colorado 78, so that's a big game there tomorrow night in the NHL. Then you have Rangers at Winnipeg. Washington at Anaheim, so I guess you got a West Coast trip there for the Capitals to monitor one Alex Ovechkin. And that's all you have there on a Tuesday night. And then Wednesday, light schedule. Vancouver at Calgary. Huge game there, for the wild card there. As separated by a point. And yeah, that's all you have. Anaheim, Utah. All right, whatever. That's what you have there in the NHL as we get down the stretch of the season. All right, now let me put on the helmet and shoulder pads to get through the NFL. And I still got baseball and also UFC, which is apology number 4. So let's get right to it with the NFL. Now, the new season in earnest begins on Wednesday. So you still have a couple days before the free agents that are out there, mainly, let's say, the quarterbacks, whether you're Justin Fields, now Aaron Rodgers, people like that are looking to sign somewhere to get themselves organized with their new address. Now, there have been a ton of signings of players that are staying put, and there have been some trades. Now, that can take place, it's fine, but the free agency cannot begin until Wednesday. But I'm sure we're going to probably hear leaks over the next 24 hours. I would say starting tomorrow, because generally the day before you start getting those leaks of, Justin Fields is going to sign here, or this linebacker is going to sign there, or whatever. But obviously, we've talked about a lot of the cuts there on Thursday. You had a lot of players that were released and teams that have also re-signed some of their players. We know about Saquon Barkley, Zach Bourne, just to name a couple of Eagles there in particular. But the trades, you've had Geno Smith being traded from the Seahawks, who are now going to go through a major overhaul, as well as the wide receiver DK Metcalf, who got traded to the Steelers. And I'm going to start here because I'll get to the other big deals in Buffalo and Cleveland. But the Raiders get their quarterback. Now, I don't know if that's a big upgrade. Now, I get it's bigger than Gardner Minshew or even Aiden O'Connell for that matter. But Geno Smith is a serviceable quarterback and a good quarterback. Is he great? He is not. Is he above average? He plays at times above average, but he's a guy that he can win you games and he can do some things. But in a big spot, when you have to absolutely positively win a game, do you trust Geno Smith? That's the big question. And if you ask me, I can't say I do. Not a knock on you, Geno. And again, calling it like I see it. But he's not a guy that I think, and especially in a loaded AFC and a loaded division, I might add, he is not a guy that's going to deliver the goods, I think, when the money's on the line. And then DK Metcalf, who requested a trade, I even talked about it, could he go to Pittsburgh? Well, he goes to Pittsburgh for a second-round draft pick, and I believe they flip-flopped their 6th and 7th round picks. But then the Steelers, who last year signed all these players and made trades for Justin Fields and Russell Wilson. And I get it. It was only for $1.2 million. And Patrick Queen, 3 years for $41 million, which they never spend in free agency. And I get it. Based on the ownership saying that we need to win playoff games. We haven't won a playoff game forever. We got to now raise the level of our spending habits. And granted that they were not necessarily mired in cap hell, but during the days of Ben Roethlisberger, when they were paying him a ton of money, and you had to pay Troy Polamalu, and you had to pay James Harrison, and you had to pay Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell, who had to sit out a year, if you recall, and you had to pay Cameron Hayward and T.J. Watt later on, but still, not enough money to maneuver when it comes to signing big-time talent. And now all of a sudden they do that. So they not only trade for DK Metcalf, but they offer him a 5-year deal at $150 million. Who is this team? I mean, really? The Steelers? Listen, I love it. And finally, they're opening up the checkbook, but they have to. And now with George Pickens going into his final year where they're going to have to pay him, TJ Watt, I hear, wants an extension. And considering what Myles Garrett got, oh my goodness, could they even break the bank and do that? And that's with Najee Harris, who's probably going to be on his way out, and a few other free agents on top of that, where you have to wonder where this Steelers team is going to either keep or even procure more talent to go up against the likes of teams in their own division, whether it's Baltimore, Cincinnati, you know about Buffalo, you know about Kansas City, you know about a Bronco team that's on the come up, a Charger team that you would think maybe that they'll do something here as far as bringing in some offensive talent to get themselves to the next level. Houston, they just traded for a wide receiver and a one Christian Kirk, and they have wide receivers that are on the mend with Stephon Diggs as well as Tank Dell. They do have Nico Collins there on top of all that, but it's a very competitive AFC. But here's the big thing when it comes to the Steelers. All right, so you have George Pickens for a year. You have Calvin Austin. Okay, fine. You have Pat Freiermuth, who you signed a 4-year deal, $48 million last year. Who's your quarterback? Where are you going to go? And then I have to read sources are saying that the front runner for the Steelers job right now is looking like it's going to be Aaron Rodgers. Seriously, we're going to go there? Now, I understand he's probably going to come in the cheap, and that's what the Steelers are looking at. But I said this all along, and I understand that if you have him at quarterback, they're not going to win this year, and they may not even win next year, but maybe year 3. Who knows? Just sign Justin Fields. You have a dual threat with the arm. I understand his accuracy is in question, but you have the legs. Don't piecemeal it with another guy that you're just going to bring in that's going to play for 1 year. And even though Aaron Rodgers, I'm sure that he may still have something left in the tank, but he can't move the way he once did based on the Achilles that he blew out 2 years ago. Yes, he still has his moments as evidence last year. All right, against a dead team walking in the Dolphins way through for 4 touchdowns. And he did have flashes of his old self when he's able to chuck it all over the yard. But is that where you want to go, Omar Khan, the GM of the Steelers? Is that the direction that you want to bring in another aging veteran quarterback like you did last year with Russell Wilson? Just sign the young guy, and it looks like Justin Fields may even go to the Jets, who needs a quarterback, as they're starting anew, as you all know. But that's where free agency, and come Thursday, we'll have it all for you as to what players are going to go where, who's going to sign with whom. But the Steelers, they need a quarterback. Bring back Justin Fields in my eyes, but if they're going to go Aaron Rodgers, I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to like it. Then you have, speaking of which, let's talk about these teams that signed their players. Josh Allen, 6 years, $330 million. He already had a contract to 2028. They ripped that up, and they gave him the most guaranteed money in the history of the sport at $250 million. So his contract's going to go to, I believe, 2030? Because 25, 6, 7, 8, 9, 30. So it's 2030. So they say goodbye to the old one. Here's the new one. 6 for 330, $250 million guaranteed. And that is your reigning MVP. So I'm not going to sniff or even think like, oh, crying in my beer. That's what they did. And kudos to the Bills fans, Bill Mafia, etc., and the organization for bringing back a guy who's obviously going to retire as a Buffalo Bill. And then all the news about Myles Garrett. I want out of Cleveland. I'm requesting a trade. I want to meet with the ownership. Jimmy Haslam says, I'm not meeting with Myles Garrett. So what do? They provide a Godfather offer. They said, we're going to give you this. And if you can't stay based on this, then I don't know what to tell you. But Myles Garrett said, how can I refuse? 4 years, he's going to make $40 million a year, and his guaranteed money is $123.5 million. It's the most given to a non-quarterback in the history of the sport. So now it's up to the Bengals, who Trey Hendrickson, who led the league in sacks as defensive lineman, who has requested a trade and has been granted by the Bengals. But remember, you have Jamar Chase, who is a guy that is going to command the most money. And even the Bengals have backed it up by saying, yes, we are planning to give Jamar Chase the most money given to a non-quarterback in the history of the sport. All right, so now they got to put their money where their mouths are, similar to what the Bills had done and now what the Browns have done, bringing back Myles Garrett. So now you'd have to think, bringing back Myles Garrett, I don't know if they're going to take Abdul Carter from Penn State as the number 2 pick overall, unless they want to do that to have a bookend to Garrett. But I would think maybe they go quarterback. Now, we still don't know about the Deshaun Watson deal. He still has two more years left with guaranteed money. They're not going to cut him, at least you don't think, because he's going to have dead cap issues and money through the roof. So just something to keep in mind as we move it along. Now, Davante Adams finds a new home as he was released by the Jets. He signs 2 years with the Rams to give a weapon to Matthew Stafford, which means obviously Cooper Kupp is going to be traded and gone, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. But he signed 2 years, $24 million as the base with roster incentives and bonuses and things of that nature, which could increase the contract, as you know. So Adams, I believe, is a significant upgrade, although you could argue Cooper Kupp, it's splitting hairs there, but Adams is now a member of the Rams. Then you had Harold Landry, who requested a trade and a release out of Tennessee. He re-ups with his former coach at Tennessee, Mike Vrabel, in New England. So no surprise there. Now we have to wait to see about Jonathan Allen, who was released by the Commanders, as I'm sure he's going to get a big-time deal. He was there 9 years, so who knows if he's long in the tooth. But we'll see where he ends up. But again, big-time player signings, trades, a lot of news, and it's only going to percolate even more here over the course of these next few days leading into the next podcast on Thursday, which you know I will have for you quick, fast, and a hurry there on Thursday. So that's what you have with the football. Now let me change tune and get in the batter's box and talk a little baseball. And you have some issues with some injuries here as we get to the middle of spring training, as we are now 8 days away from, in essence, the baseball season beginning in Japan with the Dodgers and Cubs. 2-game series out there before the season truly begins 2 weeks from this coming Thursday. But the Yankees, who have already been hammered with injuries, whether your name is Luis Hill, who's going to be out for a few months with that shoulder issue, Giancarlo Stanton with the elbow inflammation, and he already got the platelet or the plasma-rich platelet injections, so who knows how long he's going to be out. And you also have an issue with DJ LeMahieu with his calf. Now you have Gerrit Cole after a start against the Twins the other day, where I believe he went 2 2/3, gave up a ton of runs, did not pitch well, and was really concerned. In fact, he came out and say that this elbow, walking off the mound, he said something wasn't right, but he does remain hopeful and optimistic that it's something equivalent to what he experienced last year, where he had that nerve issue in his forearm elbow area where he missed the first couple of months of the year. Now, the MRI has not been revealed, although he already has the MRI, or had it, I should say. Now, if there's a tear of the UCL ligament, as we know, that could be an issue where you may not see him for a year and a half. Is it a situation where it's similar to Masahiro Tanaka, where, remember, he had that partial tear, but he pitched through it and was actually a steady pitcher for the Yankees, in particular in the postseason? So that is a big question mark surrounding Yankee land. And although that will decimate him for the season, because remember, the American League, they're the favorites to win by far. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear, you can argue with me with any other team that's out there. I'm not taking the bait on that. But they could survive without him, even without Heel. Now, I understand you're rolling the dice with Carlos Rodon, with Marcus Stroman, with guys like that, where Clark Schmidt, where you're not going to know from one start to the next if you're going to get any consistency and any just solid outings from these guys, where you know with Heel coming off a Rookie of the Year, and with Cole, you know that he's going to be steady, if not spectacular. But that could be a huge hit. We'll have to wait and see what the MRI, when it's revealed to us, and then we'll go from there. Then the Orioles, Grayson Rodriguez, who you would think is going to be anointed the ace come opening day there on the 27th. He's got to be shut down for 7 to 10 days with inflammation in his elbow. So he's not even going to pitch over the course of that week to 10-day period, which does not bode well if you ask me, considering that the only big offseason signing that the Orioles had was a one Charlie Morton at 41 years of age. Obviously, Corbin Burns went to Arizona. They don't really have a lot of pitching depth with the Dean Kramers and guys like that, the Kyle Bradishes of the world. So with Rodriguez shut down, who knows to what extent that's going to be if he's not going to start with the big club there in 2.5 weeks. Then you had Francisco Alvarez. He's going to be out 6 to 8 weeks with a broken hamate bone, which is a bone right at the wrist area, right where the fifth metatarsal starts. If you're watching on YouTube, it's right there. But for Alvarez, who was a guy that had his injuries last year, had a broken thumb, suffered at the plate. He had 25 homers 2 years ago. Last year only had 11. Struggled throughout the postseason, although he broke out of it late in that Dodger series. But with Alvarez out and Luis Torres in, that's going to be a significant blow to a guy that is looking forward to bouncing back to his offensive stature of a couple of years ago, especially with a long lineup that includes, as we all know, Juan Soto and Francisco Lindor and Pete Alonso, etc. So 6 to 8 weeks means that he's probably not going to come back to early May, considering we're already getting toward the mid part of March. So you had that situation there. Then you had Vladimir Guerrero Jr. come out to say that the final offer to the Blue Jays was a little less than $600 million. Was that over 8 years, 10 years, 12 years? I understand. $600 million is still that much. Maybe it was 12 for $600 million, where he would average out to be $50 million a year. Again, we don't know the details of that, but for Vladimir Guerrero Jr., if that's what he's going to offer, he better have a killer season, because I don't think he'll get anything close to that. He may get in the 4s, maybe close to 5, but if you want 6, he's going to have to put up MVP caliber numbers, if you ask me. So let's see what's going to happen with Vladdy Jr. this year. And in the Athletics, they re-upped Lawrence Butler to a 7-year, $65.5 million deal. That's also on the heels of what we saw earlier this offseason with a one Brent Rooker, who signed, I believe it was at $50 million. No, 60. Was it 5 for 60? I believe it was, the DH of the Athletics. So the Athletics making moves here before the start to keep their young, good nucleus intact. And then you have Tyler Naquin. This is a little bit of a twist. The former Indian/Guardian, also played for the Mets there a little bit, as well as the White Sox. He's going to return to Major League Baseball this year, but as a pitcher. So kudos to you, Tyler Naquin, to see whether or not you could stick with the big club. Now, I don't know if he's going to be a starter. I would think he's probably going to be a reliever to go all out for one inning. So for Naquin, all the best to him as he tries to latch on back to the organization that he once knew and grew up in. So that's what you have with the baseball as far as the latest and greatest goes there. And then, let me see. No, that's pretty much it when it comes to that. And then lastly, as I get into the octagon, and this is apology number 4. Because for the light heavyweight title and Alex Pereira, I didn't know that fight was taking place this weekend. So hand raised high in the air, terrible job on my part. And he went up against a guy, and I never heard of him before. And you know me with the MMA people, I'm not hip to it like maybe other podcast hosts are. But of course I do follow it, and that's why I had to apologize. That's a bout that I should have put on notice and for those to look forward to. But he loses to Magomed Ankalaev in a unanimous decision. And for Ankalaev, he rocked Pereira there in the second round. It's based on highlights and just what I read from the tea leaves. And had Pereira on his back foot the whole fight. Couldn't get anything going. Couldn't muster up anything. And like I mentioned, he had that left hook there really in the latter seconds of that second round, which dazed Pereira. But he stood through, went through all 5 rounds, and the judges scored it unanimously and by considerable margin. I believe 2 judges, 48-47. The other was 49-46. And for Pereira, who was trying to do something that had not been seen in the likes of the UFC platform, where he was going to win his 5th defense title in 500 days. And that's quite a bit. You're talking about not even a year and a half. Because a year and a half would be about 540 days. And to go through 5 title defenses condensed in that period of time says a lot for the toughness and the heart that Pereira has. But for Ankalaev, he was able to put up his own game plan. He was able to get in a few strikes which were critical, especially early on in that bout. And for Ankalaev, there's going to be a rematch based on what Dana White said. And you would think Pereira is going to come at him big time, which if he does win will set up a trilogy with the likes of both fighters. But for Pereira, I know that had to be a tough loss, a bitter one to swallow considering another defense title and falling short of that. And I'm sure there's going to be, you would think in the coming months, another rematch. And I will let you know for sure if that's going to be the case. I will be all over it and obviously watch it and critique it there a little bit more proper than just watching highlights and piecemealing it together based on some of the things that I've read online and trying to formulate an opinion on this fight and therefore sharing it with you guys and gals. And again, lastly, apologizing for not only the first, second, third, but 4th time here in this podcast, because as I mentioned earlier, and I'll say one last time, to have you be a part of this, and if you stuck stuck out through this whole podcast to listen to this point, again, not only am I sincerely grateful, I'm thankful, blessed that you did carve out precious time to listen to me. And on top of all that, knowing that I'm going to continue to be credible as well as transparent and accurate and accountable for everything that I speak into this microphone and into this camera. So you know you will not go awry when it comes to listening to sports talk and listening to get sports news from yours truly. Now, that'll do it, my good people. That was a busy podcast. That was just a little over an hour and 11 minutes. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify with the promos at the start, a little bit more than that. So I'm approaching an hour and 20. But I had to cover it all. And you know this is your place to do so. All in one podcast. So you don't have to get your UFC from one or your NBA from another or Major League Baseball, National Hockey League, golf, tennis, boxing, etc. It is all under this one umbrella. And I got you covered when it comes to what is going on in the world of sports. So once again, thank you so much for stopping by. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe, rate, review on the aforementioned Apple and Spotify platforms, as well as wherever other platform that you consume podcasts. Of course, the YouTube channel at JReels, where I put up shorts. Yesterday, I took a bit of a break despite the fact there was a lot going on in sports, but now I'm back at it. I put up a couple of videos this morning. So please peep those if you can and subscribe. In the process, I would sincerely appreciate that as I'm trying to approach 600 subscribers as of today. Right now I'm at 580, 81, around there. So please do so there. And if you want to hit me up with a question, comment, or suggestion, you can do so at the following: Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, The J-Reels Podcast, Twitter, JReels1, just a number, or the old-fashioned way, The J-Reels Podcast at gmail.com. You know I'll be more than happy to follow up with you guys and gals, because whether you do or do not know, this is what I love to do, people. Even getting up at 5 early just to get my outline together, to talk about what it is. I eat all this up. This is what I consume pretty much since birth. Sports has been a part of my fabric, fiber of my every being. As I say, it's in the blood, it's in the DNA. Talking sports since birth. And one more time, as long as I'm alive, kicking and breathing, and that I have this platform to spew, to critique and analyze, etc., you know I will give you anything and everything when it comes to passion, fire, energy, fury, with my thoughts, opinions, critiques, praise, analysis, feelings on anything and everything that happens on the world of the diamond, ice, gridiron, hardwood, golf course, racetrack, tennis court, boxing ring, octagon, you name it. From my lips to your ears, from my heart to your soul, from where I am to wherever you are, the J-Reels Podcast always comes correct, direct, and in full effect. From the South Bronx, the South Beach, the South Central, the South Pacific, and all points beyond. Peace, love, and God bless everybody. And until next time on the J-Reels Podcast, on the flip, baby.